Okay, so we're at 12:01 now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with our presentation today. My name is Jeremy Heilman. I am the One Orlando Registrar here at the Orange County Regional History Center. Thank you for joining me today for Lunch and Learn, where we're going to discuss one of Orlando's most notable residents and likely the most traveled resident of Orlando, astronaut John Young. Generally, these Lunch and Learns are hosted on Fridays, but being that today is September 24th, today would have been Young's 90th birthday, so we wanted to make a point to celebrate him today. So although John was not born in Central Florida, he spent his formative years in Orlando and always was considered a bit of a hometown hero, speaking about the Central Florida area and being connected to the location throughout his life. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type those into the Q&A up above, and I will address those at the end of the presentation. So I will go ahead and get started here with the John Young Lunch and Learn. So just to start things off, it would take much longer than the hour that we have allotted today to kind of go over the specifics of all of his accomplishments within his NASA career, or to break down the more sort of technical details of his missions. So the hope today is to focus a bit more on the man himself and his ties to Orlando and some of the things locally that either share his namesake or are part of his story. So just real quick to show just an overview of his NASA missions, what he is most known for on at least a national level. You see a pretty impressive resume here with Gemini 3, Gemini 10, Apollo 10, Apollo 16, STS-1 and STS-9, which were early space shuttle missions. So he holds the distinction of being the only astronaut to fly on Gemini, Apollo, and the space shuttle, and is one of 12 moonwalkers. So all told, he worked for NASA for 42 years, at one point serving as the chief of the astronaut office. He was well respected by his peers and was known as an astronaut's astronaut. So as we move through John's story, I will highlight three of his most notable missions that provide some insight into his personality and his legacy, as well as have a bit of a local connection. But just to give you an idea of kind of his credentials here. So John was born on September 24th, 1930 in San Francisco, California, to Wanda and William Young. In 1932, his family moved to Cartersville, Georgia, where his father was originally from. With this being the end of the Great Depression, the Youngs followed the best opportunity for work and ended up moving to Florida in 1936. His father initially went to work as a transportation manager in the Dr. Phillips community, with the family settling at a home in College Park. So during John's first year of elementary school, his mother was actually taken from the family home and institutionalized. He recounts this story in his autobiography, explaining that he was too young to really understand what was going on, but his mother suffered from schizophrenia. His father just explained to him that she wasn't well, again, because he was kind of too young to understand the specifics of all that. He said that he never noticed any of her struggles prior to that, but she was actually put into a straitjacket in front of him, which again, John did not really grasp the significance of at the time. She was taken to the Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee and sadly never returned to be with her family. So John and his younger brother returned to Cartersville to stay with their family for about a year and a half before coming back and spending the rest of his childhood in Orlando. During World War II, his father enlisted in the Navy, and when he returned from duty, he found work as a plant superintendent at Plymouth Citrus. So John had spent one of his college summers working as a helper at the plant there. So his father would remarry in 1954. So when you see his parents at any of the post-mission celebrations or interviewed by the media, that actually would have been his stepmother, Ruth, and not his birth mother, Wanda. So John attended Princeton Elementary, which still exists in the College Park neighborhood, save for third grade and part of second grade that he attended while he was living in Georgia. and later went to Memorial Junior High School, which is near Lake Eola, was near Lake Eola. Mhm. Okay. Sorry, we had a little technical question here. Can everyone hear me? Can anyone? Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for the delay there. So let's see. So anyway, John attended Memorial Junior High, which was located on Roslyn Avenue near Lake Eola. It was later cleared for the Robert Meyer Inn. And when he visited Orlando in 1981 after his first shuttle mission, he was speaking about his childhood and mentioned a story about setting a vacant lot on fire in College Park. His quote was, "We were roasting some oranges and it got away from us." So John was not an over the top personality, but he had a very quick wit and a dry sense of humor. So anyone who had seen interviews with him can kind of appreciate his delivery of quotes such as this one. So he also spoke about going to movies at the Beecham Theater on Orange Avenue, which still exists and is actually very close to where I am sitting at the History Center right now. One of his major hobbies was building model airplanes, which would contribute to his interest in flying. When he was 12, he began working at the local Piggly Wiggly, which are no longer here in the Orlando area, but is still a popular grocery store chain in some parts of America. This particular store was located on 70 East Colonial Drive, which is the corner of Colonial and Magnolia here in downtown, and is now home to a storage rental facility. So if you want to go check that out, that is where the Piggly Wiggly was. So one of the sites that you can still see related to John Young here in Orlando is what is called here the John Young House. In 1945, the family moved into the house at 815 West Princeton Street in College Park. This is where John would live for most of his high school years until leaving home. Although the family had several homes in the area over the years, this is the one that's sort of publicly recognized for those who are kind of looking to see John Young's house. It was designated a Florida Heritage Site in 1999. His parents would later move to a house a few blocks away on West Yale Avenue, but would continue to live in College Park until William Young passed away in 1982. This also solidified Young's status as sort of a hometown hero here, as this is where his family would live throughout their lives, so he would always return to visit them. And I know that's sort of a big part of connecting someone back to a town is visiting your parents or your family. So of course, the house has sold several times over the years since the Youngs have lived there. It most recently sold in May of 2020. So sadly, you've just missed your chance to live there, but maybe someday it will be up for sale again. And of course, you can still see that over on West Princeton Street. So John attended Orlando High School, which was located on Robinson Street, just outside the kind of main downtown Orlando area. The physical school that Young attended was built in 1926 and served as Orlando High School until 1952. Young attended all of his high school years there and graduated in the class of 1948. So while he was there, he played football, ran track, and excelled academically. He also worked as a stage manager in the high school auditorium, doing setup for plays and lecture sessions. The History Center's collection includes many of Orlando High's yearbooks from that era, which includes a copy of the 1948 edition, which has John's senior photo that you see here. So he was awarded the Guernsey Good Citizenship Cup during his graduation ceremony, which was the school's highest award at the time. he commented that at that time he had no idea what constituted a good citizen. So a little humor from him in his later years. He was also named the most outstanding scholar by Principal William Boone for earning straight A's since the 9th grade. So pretty impressive. You see his senior quote there, with your quiet poise, you appear a bit modest. So kind of an interesting quote from someone who would go on to achieve some pretty remarkable things. And of course, his dapper photograph there from his teenage years. So the award that he received from Principal William Boone is kind of a famous name here in Orlando. He had been the principal of Orlando High for many years. And as sort of a interesting aside, Orlando High School closed in June of 1952, so only a few years after John graduated. And on the last day of school, Boone had a heart attack while working at his desk and sadly passed away. So one of the two schools that ended up replacing Orlando High was named in his honor, Boone High School, with the other being Edgewater High. The building that John actually went to school in is now known as Howard Middle School, so that is still on Robinson Street here in Orlando. So another site that's available should you want to visit anything kind of related to John Young. We also have another photo here from the National Honor Society that year in 1948. You can see John just to the right of the podium there. Again, much younger than some of the photos that you may be familiar with, but interesting to kind of get a look at what he was like as a teenager. So after high school, John attended Georgia Tech on an ROTC scholarship and earned a degree in aeronautical engineering in 1952. He joined the Navy right after he completed school and was on board the USS Laws for most of his first year. That ship spent some time in Korea during the Korean War. Much like his NASA accomplishments, his work in the Navy could probably be an entire presentation unto itself. But Young spent his career as a naval aviator and a test pilot, where he achieved multiple time to climb records, so meaning that he achieved certain altitude thresholds the quickest, and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1962. He was still officially in the military during much of his NASA career, retiring from the Navy in 1976 as a captain. So when you see him referred to as Captain Young or Captain John Young, that's a naval distinction, and that's what that is sort of associated with there. So his work as a test pilot would lead him to be selected as part of Astronaut Group 2 in 1962, which was nicknamed the New Nine, following the original Mercury 7 astronauts. So only the second group ever, and Young was a part of that, which included some pretty impressive names that you may recognize, including Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell, and Pete Conrad. In the early days of NASA, the astronauts primarily lived in Houston, Texas, but spent a great deal of time in Central Florida, and specifically in Cape Canaveral, which is within the collecting area here at our Regional History Center, at the NASA Launch Operations Center, later known as the Kennedy Space Center. So even though Young no longer lived here, he was around quite a bit in the area. The astronauts would actually stay in Cocoa Beach, spending their mostly limited free time that they had in that area in Brevard County. So Young's first space mission was Gemini 3. The pronunciation of Gemini, I think my natural inclination would be to pronounce this word Gemini. So there is some discrepancy on how folks say the word. I don't think it's anything to get super hung up on, but the astronauts themselves did say Gemini. And at one point there was an official NASA statement on that being the correct way to say the word. So take that for what you will. This was actually the last flight where mission control was located in Florida. On all the following missions, there was a launch control locally, and then those operations would shift to mission control in Houston. This was the first manned mission of Project Gemini. The numbering system is a little confusing, so 1 and 2 would have been unmanned missions, with the third being the first manned mission. And his crewmate was Virgil Gus Grissom, who was of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. So actually that would make Young the first astronaut to fly outside of the original group. So another sort of impressive accolade on his part. This was the first American space mission with more than one person on board. And the objective was to essentially test the Gemini vehicle, which had thrusters that made the spacecraft more maneuverable, which would later be important to the objectives of reaching the moon, which was sort of what the Gemini program was about, to sort of serve as a bridge to that ultimate goal. They called their spacecraft Molly Brown, which was a reference to the unsinkable Molly Brown. Margaret Brown was an actual person who survived the Titanic. Her story and the lore surrounding her life became more famous with a musical and a movie based on the fictionalized accounts of her life. The connection to this mission dealt with Grissom and his Mercury mission, where his Liberty Bell 7 capsule sank into the Atlantic Ocean after splashdown. Luckily, Grissom survived the ordeal, but chose to name his second mission, the Molly Brown, as sort of a bit of a joke. Allegedly, NASA did not care for the name. When discussing this, he said, "Would you rather we call it the Titanic?" And they settled for the Molly Brown. So one of the sort of notable stories that gets told associated with this mission is regarding a sandwich, which is kind of interesting. The food that was provided for the astronauts during the early years of NASA was probably less than desirable, but all the items were carefully planned out, which factored in their nutritional needs as well as the physical makeup of the food itself. Because of the weightless environment, the food was housed in tiny pouches or compressed in cubes with a bit of like a gelatin-esque layer on top to make sure that crumbs would not float around the cabin. As this was sort of still all pretty new, there were some concerns that these crumbs could become lodged in instrumentation panels and cause all sorts of issues with that. So that was definitely a concern early on. Of course, with the astronauts being sort of prone to push boundaries, it didn't take long for someone to break those rules and bring along their own food, which would be our subject today, John Young. This event has been somewhat mythologized, but it is believed that astronaut Wally Schirra of the Mercury 7 purchased a corned beef sandwich leading up to the launch and handed it off to John to take aboard. The sandwich itself came from Wolfie's Restaurant and Sandwich Shop, which was at the Ramada Hotel in Cocoa Beach. The hotel and the restaurant were located on A1A, where much of the sort of social activity for the astronauts took place in those days. And some of those old hotels do exist in some form. Sadly, Wolfie's is gone, but part of the old Ramada makes up a certain portion of a hotel that is still there, known as the International Palms Resort. So Young smuggled the sandwich aboard in his pocket in his pressure suit, and during the mission revealed it to Grissom. Grissom took a bite out of the sandwich, which was coming apart pretty quickly, and the crumbs, like expected, did start flying around the cabin. Grissom quickly put the sandwich into his pocket to prevent it from breaking up even more, and the two decided that this was probably not going to work and moved on. Unfortunately, back on Earth, there were some people who were apparently upset by this incident. As I mentioned, sort of subject to a lot of folklore, but I can't really say for sure how mad any of Young and Grissom's actual direct supervisors were, but it did become a big enough of a concern that there was a meeting held by the House Committee on Appropriations. Part of the mission was to test space food, and along with the supposed danger of the crumbs, the infamous sandwich could potentially have wasted significant taxpayer dollars. NASA had to ensure that to government officials that this type of thing would not happen again in the future. Young would actually downplay the significance of this event and the attention that that sandwich would receive in his book, where he alleges that this was not even the first space flight where an astronaut brought a sandwich aboard, which implies that at least a few of the original Mercury astronauts had previously done something similar and apparently had gotten away with it. He said that the politicians had thought that they had ignored the necessary testing of the approved space food, which was not the case, and that somehow this would have been a sign of a bigger problem of NASA officials not being aware or in control of astronaut behavior. He felt the whole thing was simply blown out of proportion. The actual sandwich itself is preserved in lucite and is on display at the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in his hometown of Mitchell, Indiana. So kind of a unique piece of history that all originated at a sandwich shop in Cocoa Beach, not far from here in Orlando. Despite the capsule's name and the issues with the sandwich, the Gemini 3 mission was successful and would help NASA get one step closer to reaching their goal of the moon, with Young adding his name to the elite list of flown astronauts. The mission made Young a bona fide Orlando icon, which led to the first of several of John Young days here in town. So there were several John Young days, at least 4 that followed missions, space missions that John Young had. But the very first one took place on April 24th, 1965. That was done in celebration of his first Gemini mission. It consisted of a motorcade, a luncheon, and a public program at Lake Eola. The speakers at the program, including Young, spoke from the deck at the Robert Meyer Motor Inn, which was the site of John's former junior high school. So kind of an interesting connection there, coming full circle with his first real big accomplishment there in NASA. That building today is known as the Metropolitan at Lake Eola, and it's a building of condos located on Rosalind. Anyone who's been to the amphitheater at Lake Eola has probably seen that building. So another site worth checking out if you're a John Young aficionado here in Orlando. The building, yeah, so you can see the building here in the photo with John. This is from our collection here, him speaking and addressing the crowd on that first John Young day. So the program itself consisted of quite a bit. He received many gifts and accolades that day. Governor Hayden Burns presented him with a plaque of the Florida Seal. Mayor Bob Carr presented him with a medal. A alumni group from Georgia Tech here locally presented him with a scroll. Artist Bill Orr, a local artist here in Orlando, presented him with a painting of himself, of Young, and he was given an honorary membership into the Orlando Chamber of Commerce. The event was also attended by then Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and if you know, you can see if you look very closely on that podium, it says Vice President of the United States. So that is why, because the Vice President was in attendance that day. So as another aspect of the program, there was a flyover of 12 Navy jets. And kind of unbelievably, it seems a little sort of difficult to imagine now, but there were 2 members of the Air Rescue Command that provided commentary over the PA system for an actual real-life helicopter demonstration in Lake Eola of how the Molly Brown capsule was recovered, with frogmen diving into the water to actually wrap the capsule and pull it out of the water there at Lake Eola. So a pretty intense thing for a celebration, but definitely something interesting and not something you would necessarily see here nowadays. But as a lot of the astronauts did in that era, Young spent a lot of his speech discussing all the support workers who helped put him into space. And he was there present with his wife at the time, Barbara, and his 2 children, Sandra and John Jr., and his parents were also present that day. As kind of an aside, specifically the luncheon that day was held at the Cherry Plaza Hotel in the Egyptian Ballroom, which also happens to be the site of Walt Disney's announcement that the Disney company was buying property here in the area. The Cherry Plaza building is still around and is known as the Post Parkside Apartments. Unfortunately, the Egyptian room is no longer there, but part of this day being the luncheon, there was a bit of a problem in that the room had been booked for over a year at that time, but because there wasn't another area that was sufficient to hold an event of that size, there kind of needed to be some negotiations there. So there was a ham radio convention taking place at the hotel that week, with the ballroom being their main exhibit space. The chairman of the convention, Mr. Wes Gardner, was called, and he would later call his committee together, and they decided that the only thing that they could do would be to empty the room in the middle of the convention, remove all the displays prior to the luncheon, and put them back late that evening. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty big ask at that time, disrupting their event and causing them to move all that sort of heavy electronic equipment out just to put it right back the same day. But despite that inconvenience, Gardner was quoted in the newspaper saying anything for John Young. So pretty exciting day here in Orlando. One thing, as I noted, John's sort of sense of humor. Another thing about him is that, at least from impressions that I've gathered from interviews and documentaries and whatnot, he didn't seem super precious about his work and would have likely kind of seen the humor and all this over the top fuss about his accomplishments. So very interesting day. I think that that's quite a bit to sort of stack in a day for John there. So very interesting. One of the sort of most notable or recognizable things people associate with John Young is the John Young Parkway. For those of you who might not be in the Orlando area, that's one of the major roadways here in Central Florida. The John Young Parkway was dedicated on February 3rd, 1971. But unfortunately, John was not present that day. He was busy working as ground support for Apollo 13 or Apollo 14, who would actually land on the moon 2 days later. But all this was taking place at sort of the height of the Apollo program, so definitely not a time where John had a lot of availability. He would attend later ceremonies marking portions, the opening of other portions of the road. So this photo that you see here is from sort of a later dedication of parts of the road as it continued expanding. There were delays in the construction material. So the road itself wasn't even ready on that February 3rd date anyway, and it would be 2 weeks until the road would actually open. Certainly not as expansive as we know it today. The road really ran just from the portion of Highway 50 north to Lee Road, so a relatively small space, given that now it runs all the way from Winter Park to Kissimmee, which, again, if you're not familiar with the area, covers quite a bit of the entire Orlando metro area here. So another, and maybe arguably John's most notable mission was Apollo 16, which took place in April of 1972. This was the 5th mission that actually landed astronauts on the moon. Young was the commander. His crewmates were Charlie Duke, that you see to the right of Young in that photograph, and Ken Mattingly to the left there. So Young and Duke were the two who actually landed on and walked on the moon, with Duke being the lunar module pilot and Young being the commander. And Ken Mattingly stayed in orbit as the command module pilot, so he did not get to specifically walk on the moon, but did make it up there, which is sort of an interesting little aside as well, because Mattingly was the astronaut who was on the crew of Apollo 13 and was taken off the mission a few days before because of exposure to the measles. And I mention this because this is actually depicted in the film Apollo 13, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where Mattingly was played by actor Gary Sinise. There is a memorable portion of the movie where Sinise as Mattingly is shown shutting off his television just before news reports of the trouble with Apollo 13, and he takes his phone off the hook. The John Young character in that movie actually comes to wake him up and alert him of the situation, and they both go in and start working on solutions to help bring Apollo 13 home. So although this is like a sensationalized version of these events, both of the men were heavily involved in that process to help with Apollo 13. Mattingly did not contract the measles, but did eventually get to fly, and luckily he did so alongside his friend John Young. So Apollo 16 allowed John Young to become the 9th person to walk on the moon. By any standard, I would say that this is quite an accomplishment. I think if you're swapping stories at a party or something like that, this would be a pretty hard one to top. Another sort of thing about Young that's been mythologized, but that I find very interesting, is that he was described as very calm by the other astronauts, which I guess can mean a lot of different things. But in this particular case, this can be quantified by his medical statistics from this mission. So it was noted that during liftoff of Apollo 16, Charlie Duke's heart rate was at 144, while Young was only at 70. So quite a significant difference there. While landing on the moon, Young's heart rate only reached 90, which, as sort of a frame of reference, Neil Armstrong, another notoriously calm astronaut, was at 150. To be fair, the Apollo 11 landing was a little bit dicier, but even so, this can mean a lot of different things. And, you know, I can't really speculate on a medical level, but I will say that if there was some measurable way to tell if someone was actually scared, maybe this might be a way to do that. You can, you know, objectively show that he didn't show any physical signs of being nervous. So another sort of interesting facet of John Young there. He would downplay it later, of course, as he tended to do. And when asked about it, he would recount his response at the time to being informed of this information after the flight is, "I told them that mine was just too old to go any faster," meaning his heart was too old, basically making a joke about his age being a little older than some of the younger astronauts coming in at the time. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 all made use of the Lunar Rover vehicle. The Lunar Rover was essentially a battery-powered buggy or car that was to be driven on the moon. During each of the 3 missions, only the commander was permitted to drive. So Young was one of the 3 people that were able to drive a car on a surface, a celestial body other than Earth, which I would imagine is another sort of interesting accomplishment that you could brag about later. Following Apollo 16, there was another John Young Day, of course, in 1972, which included an unveil of a plaque commemorating John Young Parkway. And the program was actually called John Young, Astronaut and Hero Who Walked on the Moon. So pretty verbose claim there, definitely. So this is a photo taken during Apollo 16, one of the most famous photos of the entire Apollo era. You can see John saluting there, and sometimes it's a little difficult to see just because of the way the surface of the moon looks in the photo, but he's actually jumping there with the gravity being obviously less than here on Earth. And this is the image that John chose for the cover of his autobiography. So definitely a great photograph, and one that pops up quite a bit when you're looking at astronaut photographs. So another entity here in town that at one point bear John Young's name was the Orlando Science Center in Lock Haven Park. The establishment that became the Science Center was actually founded in 1955 and was originally the Central Florida Museum. It was an anthropology museum, but later they decided to focus on science. And in 1973, they changed their name to the John Young Science Center. It was known as such from 1973 until 1984. So this is another way in which many people from the area, at least of a certain age, remember Young. So as far as the removal of the name John Young, there was a gentleman named Edmund Murray who had amassed wealth as a farm equipment businessman, and he passed away in 1983 and left money for various local organizations. He gifted the Science Center $215,000, but stipulated that the name had to be changed to the Orlando Science Center in order to receive that money. So not sure of the specifics behind this one in terms of why. My thought is that Mr. Murray probably just wanted the name to better reflect the community rather than a vendetta against Young or anything like that, but I can't be sure. The board of directors informed John about the situation and the proposed name change, and his response to this was great. You name it whatever you want. The planetarium was still named for him, which I believe stuck until they moved into the new building that we know today as the Orlando Science Center, which opened in 1997. The previous building became the Orlando Shakespeare Theater, so some of you may recognize the building in this photograph as the Orlando Shakes, as it's known. You can see the white portion in the middle there, the planetarium dome. That was still named in his honor that entire time, and that space today is used for special events at the Shakes and is known as the Dr. Phillips Patrons Room. So I believe that the Science Center still has a painting of John Young displayed as a bit of an homage to their past there. So something that you can check out next time that you visit the Science Center. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're back here. So another mission, the third that we're going to kind of talk about today, is STS-1, which was the first space shuttle mission. It was the first manned flight of the space shuttle. And as I'm sure many of you know, the space shuttle program differed quite a bit from its predecessors. Rather than a series of missions designed to reach a certain objective, the goal was to create a reusable vehicle that could carry out any number of tasks and experiments, which would make spaceflight a much more regular occurrence. Perhaps did not become as routine as maybe originally anticipated, but the program itself ended up outlasting any previous flight system many times over, with the time between the first mission and the last mission in 2011 being over 30 years. Each flight was launched locally from Cape Canaveral, so another sort of local connection there. The crews would grow to be much greater. I believe 7 was pretty typical. I think the largest crew ever of a space shuttle was 8. But the first only had 2 astronauts on board, which was John Young and Robert Crippen, who you see to John's right there. At that point, Young was the longest tenured astronaut, and this would be the second time that he was a part of the crew, the first crew of a new spacecraft. The main objective of the flight was essentially to test the worthiness of the vehicle, which they did accomplish. The first shuttle missions were considered somewhat test flights, with Young's initial mission being called the boldest test flight in history. STS-5 was the first mission that was actually considered fully operational. Another John Young Day would follow this mission, which included a motorcade from the Naval Training Center in Lake Baldwin to Princeton Elementary, where he had lunch with students, and then on to Lake Eola for a rally, Orlando City Hall, and then to the Science Center, where they unveiled a new sign for the John Young Science Center. The Orlando Sentinel on the morning of that John Young Day actually had these kind of cool little things that you could cut out to make your own pom-poms. So it says here that you can welcome home John Young by joining in the festivities at Lake Eola. And it has instructions to cut out these strips of newspaper to make pom-poms to help celebrate the day. So kind of a cool little thing that, even after several missions, that his hometown was still very excited about his accomplishments. That mission would be successful, obviously, and then he would fly Columbia again in 1983, again as the commander, and this would be his final space flight. Here is a photo of yet another sort of establishment name for John Young. Still currently in operation is John Young Elementary School. It is located just off the John Young Parkway, kind of in the south portion of Orlando. So there's a photo, a recent photo. I believe Mrs. Hill is the Teacher of the Year for those of you there. So congratulations to her. And then in addition to kind of the local things named for John, there are a lot of places that you can visit to see sort of artifacts related to him. Now, the actual capsules that he flew in are all on public display, but unfortunately none are in the Central Florida area. So I wanted to kind of point out some things that you could go see, especially things here at the Kennedy Space Center, which is definitely something that anyone interested in John Young or any other astronaut or the space program should definitely check out. John is a member of the Astronaut Hall of Fame, so you can see his plaque at the Heroes and Legends attraction at Kennedy Space Center. He was actually inducted in the second class, with the first class being all the original 7 astronauts. So definitely a pretty strong compliment and accomplishment again of John there. You can visit the Apollo Saturn V Rocket Center, which is a pretty amazing attraction which highlights the Apollo mission and features an unused Saturn V rocket. It runs the length of the building for those that have not been there, and it's definitely one of the, I think, the most impressive and coolest things that you can go see. So this photo is kind of the back end of that at the bottom. Definitely worth checking out. I believe, although Kennedy Space Center is currently open, this particular attraction is only reachable by bus, and because of the sort of current social distancing situation, those buses are not running, so it is temporarily closed. But if you haven't been, I highly recommend it, so you should go check it out when it reopens. At the Space Shuttle Atlantis building, you can see the actual Atlantis vehicle, which although not one that John actually commanded, it is the similar style vehicle. You can get a feel for how impressive of a piece of machinery that shuttle is. Also featured there is the Forever Remembered exhibition, which is a tribute to the Challenger and Columbia tragedies. It's very tastefully and well done, and you can actually see a portion of the Columbia vehicle where, of the ship that John commanded. Definitely some heavy content in there, so be advised of that, but it's definitely worth checking out. And then another thing that you'll be able to see kind of from the outside at least is following at the 25th anniversary of the first shuttle mission, NASA renamed the firing room at the Launch Control Center after Young and Crippen. So the Launch Control Center is kind of the building by the big vehicle assembly building with the big windows that you see on a lot of the coverage of launches or anything related to the Kennedy Space Center. So as you go by on the bus tour, you can also check that out. The main kind of room there is named after Young. So another sort of tribute to him that you can check out there. Additionally, we do have some items on display here at the History Center on the 3rd floor. You can see his jumpsuit and a couple of jackets, as well as ephemera from several of his launches and some awards that he received over the years. So here at the History Center, although John had received many sort of accolades and honors in his life, one named after him that's very near to the History Center's heart is the John Young History Maker Award, in conjunction with the John Young History Maker Celebration. It is an award given by the Orange County Regional History Center and the Historical Society of Central Florida, honoring Young. It's given to a Central Floridian whose lifetime achievement has made an historic impact on the community, and Young was the first to receive this award in 2005, and the tradition continues to this day. The first ceremony was held outside of the History Center and had over 500 guests, with 150 being those who had attended Orlando High School with John Young. So definitely a strong sort of compliment from his classmates there. Also, Mayor Buddy Dyer attended, as well as former Orlando mayors Bill Frederick and Carl Langford, and his crewmate from the first shuttle mission, Bob Crippen. And I think that that goes to show the respect that he had from his peers, both from his younger days and his NASA career, and the respect he had from the community. So, in also that going along with the John Young History Maker Award, there is a John Young History Maker Scholarship, which is awarded to a high school senior who is planning on attending college or university with the goal of making a difference in the future in a positive way. So definitely something that carries on the legacy of John Young to this day. And we're actually coming up upon the latest John Young History Maker celebration, which will be held on September 29th. That will be held virtually, and I will give you a little more information here in a minute about how you can find out more. So kind of wrapping up the main portion of our presentation today, John Young passed away on January 5th, 2018 at the age of 87. And as I mentioned earlier, today would have been his 90th birthday. So happy birthday to Captain John Young. And although it is sad that he is not with us any longer, his legacy certainly lives on, certainly on a local level, but also through his contributions to NASA and the historic events that he was part of. So thank you very much for joining me today. I want to kind of point you to our website, thehistorycenter.org. It's kind of a big one-stop shop for anything going on here at the History Center. There you can find out how you can virtually attend the 2020 John Young History Maker Award celebration via donation. You can get your ticket by logging on there. You can also learn much more about upcoming programs that we have that are similar to this one. Our next Lunch and Learn will be on Friday, October 2nd. It is Keepers of the Heritage, Puerto Rican Artists of Central Florida. So another very interesting Lunch and Learn that you can check out. You can also find out membership information, how to donate to the collection. Right now we have a big push for items related to COVID-19, so photographs, audio, video recordings, that kind of thing. So you'll be able to find out kind of how all that works and what we're looking for on there, as well as more general donations to the collection. And you can learn about other ways to support the History Center. So please check that out if you have any questions or anything about the History Center. And I very much thank you for joining me today. So I'm gonna pop back on here on video, and I'm gonna see if we have any questions today that I can maybe answer about John Young. All right, so I'm gonna hang out here for a few minutes if anyone has any questions. Right now, I do not see any in our chat box there, but if you'd like to ask anything, or if you would like to, you know, find out anything else, just let me know. I will be here for a little while longer. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I see a question. Does John Young have children? Yes, he has two children, Sandra and John Jr. So Everybody's so nice in the chat. I really appreciate that. Let's see. I had a question if his nickname in school was Brains. I don't know that, but I would imagine that seems like somewhat of an appropriate name. That doesn't seem like much of a stretch. I think, like I had kind of mentioned earlier, I think John had like a sort of a dry, unique sense of humor. So I'm sure that there was a lot of kind of joking and teasing going on, both, you know, to him and from him. So that would not surprise me in the least if he was nicknamed Brains. Did he live in College Park when he attended OHS? Yes. So the house that I showed the photo of on West Princeton Street, that is where John lived at least the last 3 years of his high school career. And then that's the kind of the home that he left from to go to college. So he did live in College Park. His parents would later move to another house in College Park. And I think, you know, over the years, there were some different houses that the family lived in. But yeah, he lived in College Park, I believe, the entire time that he lived in Orlando, even when he first arrived here as a child. So he did bounce around a little bit in that particular neighborhood, but he was always in College Park. It's a little unusual here, just I guess doing this on Zoom. I just, if anybody has anything else that they want to address, but normally we typically do the lunch and learns in this this conference room here in person. So yeah, talking to no response here is a little unique, but hopefully everyone enjoyed this today. There weren't too many technical difficulties or anything like that, so.